Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to our distinguished panelists, colleagues, and participants to our next installment in the Development Dialogues, where today we will be looking at managing urban risk and building resilience, an old challenge which has gained new urgency. Today's deliberation on urban resilience are of immediate interest to all of us. With the world having taken a definitive turn towards urbanization, it would be a travesty of sorts not to talk about urban resilience while deliberating upon the future of development. All projections indicate that cities will define the development trajectory over the coming decades and beyond. With an increased manifestation of risk in cities, the risk landscape is becoming largely urban. The frenetic pace of urban expansion is changing risk patterns, redefining risk development interface, and deepening the realization that the ill effects of risk-averse development will hit us hard and sooner, if not addressed in time. In fact, perhaps even now. Convergence of people, development, infrastructure, socio-economic vulnerabilities, and risk of all typologies in cities calls for a sharper focus on urban resilience building than before. And the current crisis we're facing now, COVID, has unraveled this imperative so starkly. Recognizing this imperative, UNDP has really looked at its urban risk management and resilience building work to identify existing unmet demands and emerging priorities to manage risk and address all dimensions of resilience. An analytical review of urban resilience practice has been undertaken and consultations held with global, regional, and national stakeholders, including members of the International Finance Institute, to inform our approach. Adding a qualitative dimension to our efforts is the focus of this session today, which brings together a constellation of eminent experts and experienced practitioners to articulate crucial dimensions and to underscore the centrality of urban resilience to the global pursuit of sustainable development and resilience building. Let's hear from them straight away. The session is structured around three key segments. First, I will invite each of the panelists to share their perspectives for 5 minutes. Thereafter, we will have an open discussion to raise some key questions and elicit further thoughts. In the end, I will request each panelist to share their top-line message for UNDP as we embark upon our translating our urban resilience strategy into an actionable programmatic offer. With these words, I have the privilege to invite Ms. Asako Okai, Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Crisis Bureau at UNDP, to set the context and to deliver her welcoming and opening remarks. Ms. Okai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, distinguished panelists, participants, colleagues, and friends. A warm welcome from me too. In today's discussion, we framed urban resilience as an old challenge gaining new urgency, as Ron has put it. Although this imperative has been evident for so long, it has become central to today's development discourse. The impact of the COVID pandemic was predominantly urban, with nearly 90% of the people affected and major socio-economic disruption caused in cities. It has exposed the soft underbelly, so to speak, of our urban development, governance, and risk management systems. Crises are no longer standalone or episodic. Their wide-ranging impact and interconnected nature pose significant socio-economic challenges, lingering much beyond their immediate occurrence. And the risks are heightened, especially in interdependent sectors of development in cities. Risks are now manifested globally in urban areas. For example, nearly 84% of the fastest growing cities face extreme climate and disaster risks, with a vast majority of these in Asia and Africa. High-risk cities are mostly in challenging development contexts, like in LDCs, low-income countries, or the small island development states, and face considerable governance deficit, as well as capacity and resource constraints. In cities, crises and risks of all types tend to converge and become concentrated. Urbanization of risks is exacerbated by pre-existing structural issues such as poverty, inequality, migration, and informality, affecting weaker segments of society the most, leaving them farther behind. In fact, the World Bank projects that COVID-19 pandemic may have pushed additional 88 million to 150 million people into extreme poverty in 2020. And their analysis indicate that these new poor will be more urban than chronic poor, more engaged in informal services, and live in congested urban settings. Driven by this sense of new urgency, UNDP recently analyzed the global frameworks, policies, programs, and tools, and as Ron had put it, conducted an extensive consultative process with a range of stakeholders to diagnose urban resilience-related demands and priorities. With over half of the humanity already becoming urban, we have arrived at a firm conviction that the theater of action has gravitated towards urban areas. It will define our ability to ensure sustainability of development and resilience to risks, as urged by the new urban agenda and the SDGs. Thus, UNDP intends to reorient its urban risk management and resilience building practices through an integrated cross-thematic approach. Going ahead, we have identified the following priorities for policy and programmatic action. First, to give most focus on neglected geographies where greatest capacity gap exists, such as small and medium-sized cities in LDCs or small island development states and lower mid-income countries, including cities in or on margins of crisis and fragile contexts. UNDP's risk assessment tools like Crisis Risk Dashboard will be strengthened and make better use of data in risk atlases, inform or Global Center for Disaster Statistics to provide actionable risk analysis and information to support their peculiar risk management and resilience building needs. Second, to strengthen urban governance by bridging the disconnect between the national policy and implementation at the municipal level, and also by stepping up engagement with key city interest groups. Effective urban governance means engaging all actors to shape urban development through connected policies and collective actions. We need to support cities to improve decision-making processes by fostering participation and overcoming traditional barriers to address existing risks and prevent new ones. Third, to ensure that urban development and services cater to the specific needs and vulnerabilities of weaker segments of urban communities. This will include improving their access to urban services like health, education, etc., and addressing their exposure to small-scale localized incidents. Fourth, to build capacity of less resourced cities to manage multidimensional risks through well-financed, risk-informed urban development planning and investments. UNDP is currently developing its risk-informed development offer to facilitate its application at city level and to bring to scale. Finally, to expand innovation for resilient urban future. Recognizing the dynamic and evolving needs in cities, potential of innovation and digital technology-based solutions must be maximized. Methodologies such as modeling, scenario planning, resilience benchmarking will be used to improve urban services and functionality, including urban planning and crisis management systems. Expertise of UNDP's Accelerator Labs and SDGs Artificial Intelligence Lab will help devise contextualized solutions. But UNDP cannot build urban resilience alone. We need to join hands in this decade of action to bring the capability of all actors and stakeholders to achieve SDGs, especially at local levels. UNDP would like to call upon all partners to adopt an all-hands-on-deck approach with particular focus on small, medium, and transitioning cities. Today, we are privileged to hear from our esteemed panel of experts presenting perspectives from the national government, city administrations, development partners, civil society, academia, and the private sector. The wealth of experience on the panel will help articulate existing unmet demands and emerging priorities, as well as ways to advance partnerships-based and also action-oriented approaches. I look forward to an engaging discussion today and synergy of action ahead. Thank you very much. Over back to you, Ron.
Ronald, you're muted. Please unmute your mic.
Thank you, Asako, for setting the tone for the session and bringing focus on some of the pertinent issues like the need to focus on small and medium cities, as well as emerging, transitioning cities, engaging actors who play a key role in urban development like the planners, builders, private sectors, and of course, all the other partners that you've called upon to support this journey. More importantly, reflecting the needs of marginalized segments of our society, addressing risk as part of the urban development process, and of course, taking a long-term view of cities as they continue to evolve and newer technologies emerge to help meet these requirements. I hope we will have some further reflection on these issues during the course of the session. Now I'd like to invite our panel of eminent experts today. I will introduce each of them as I invite them to take the floor. In the interest of time, I will only introduce them briefly, and the detailed bios of each of our panelists can be found on the session page on the Development Dialogue website. Beginning our conversation today, our first panelist, Mr. Kamal Kishore, joins us from the Government of India. I have the privilege to invite Kamal, the member of the National Disaster Management Authority in India, to discuss with us his perspectives. Thank you, Kamal, for joining us, and I hand you the floor for 5 minutes to reflect on bridging the gaps between national policy and city application for urban resilience.
Thank you very much, Ronald, and I'm very grateful to UNDP for convening this discussion. The urban resilience issues have become even more topical in the wake of the pandemic. So it's really very timely that we're talking about this, and Asako's opening presentation really has framed the issues very nicely. So today I'm going to give you some perspectives from India, which is a large country, 1.3 billion people, 30% of us are urban, rapidly urbanizing. In the next couple of days, more people will live in urban areas than in rural areas. And with a lot of challenges, very different kinds of urban contexts. You have Bombays and Delhis, and then you have secondary order cities like Indore and Jabalpur, and then you have really small hill towns like Shimla and Darjeeling. So you have the whole variety of context. So what I want to say by way of some initial remarks in this opening segment is centered around three big buckets of topics. The first is law or laws, the second is resources, and the third is capacities. So towards the end of the last century and the beginning of this century, 21st century, a number of countries around the world enacted disaster risk management legislation. In India, we came up with the legislation in 2005. A number of countries after the Indian Ocean tsunamis enacted laws. And I would go out on a limb to say that most of the laws, most of the legislative arrangements that have been put in place 15 to 25 years ago are urbanism blind. They have a framework which is a national, subnational, local, but when they talk about local, they deal with the rural and the urban in the same way. Whereas these contexts are very different, and we have to begin to address this at the legislative level and have special provisions for the cities. Of course, cities are also of many different kinds, and we can see what is the kind of flexibility, what is the kind of urban lens we can build into our legislative systems. In the context of laws, there is additional challenge, particularly for countries like mine, where you have the urban and you have the rural, and in the middle of it is peri-urban, something which may be right now classified as rural, but officially classified as rural. But if you go there, and you can see that it is actually fast becoming urban. In 10 years, 15 years, it will be reclassified as urban. So how do we manage what is there in between? I think it's really important to look into that, because that is really going to determine the future. So in essence, what I'm saying is that how do we make legislation more urban sensitive, and how do we make sure that legislation provides us with the tools to manage the transition from rural to urban? My second point is about resources. In the wake of the pandemic, the municipal finance is really under a lot of stress. The capability of urban local bodies to raise money, their revenue streams have, dwindled significantly. Most of the money they have is actually now going to just paying salaries to their staff. 60-70% of the urban finance is just to maintain the staffing structure, the offices, what to talk about investing in resilience. So I think there has to be some imagination there. How do we devolve national level finance to the city level to put more resources at the municipal level? We have had the 15th Finance Commission in India, which has provided specific resources for urban disaster risk management concerns. But I think even that is not going to be enough. We really have to look at the fundamentals of municipal finance and see how we begin to bolster that. We have to really put our money where action really needs to happen. My final point is about capacities. In the last few years, in the last 3-4 years, the term systemic resilience has gained a lot of currency. But when you look at the profession of urban planning, that's exactly what systemic resilience means. There is a reason why urban planning is called a complex, challenging discipline, because it sits at the intersection of multiple disciplines. It looks at not just the hard capacities, but also the soft capacities. It talks about not just the government, but civil society, citizens' engagement in determining the future of cities. I think we really have to reclaim the profession of urban planning. For too long, we were talking about from urban planning to urban management. I think that's really, in my view, if I want to be provocative, that's, I think, intellectually lazy. We really have to rediscover urban planning and have the urban planning capacity in our cities, in our towns, also in areas which are not yet classified as urban, but quickly transforming from being rural to being peri-urban to being urban. So with these thoughts on, how do we fix legislation, how do we fix resourcing issue at the city level, and how do we have capacities to think holistically at the level of cities through rediscovering the profession of urban planning. Thank you very much, Ronald, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kamal, for a very insightful exchange. And you categorize your comments in three themes: laws, resources, and capacities. And I want to just quickly draw on some of the very important points that came from your statement. Laws being urban blind, particularly in its attempt to provide differentiated requirements for urban to rural spaces, managing the transition of spaces from rural to urban, the blindness of the legislation around those particular areas. And of course, the issue of resources, devolving national finance to put more resources where the action actually happens. And last, this call for the renaissance of urban planning, linking Absolutely. It to the whole idea around systemic risk management. Thank you very much, Kamal, for that. And we're hoping to hear from our participants and other speakers around some of those insightful remarks. We now have Dr. Nazmul Hook, our second speaker, who heads the Resilient Development Program and DRR division of the ICLEI, and has been working with city administrations to meet their capacities for development. Dr. Hook will speak to us today on enhancing city capacities to meet existing and emerging challenges. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Hook, and the floor is yours for your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ronald, for your kind invitation. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am very much delighted to be here and to share my reflections on enhancing city capacities to meet existing and emerging challenges. As Ronald Jackson introduces, I am Nazmul Haq. I am head of Global Resilient Development Program at ICLEI World Secretariat in Bonn in Germany. And ICLEI, in shortly, is the largest network of cities, towns, and regions in the world, having more than 2,500 members. Our members represent different socio-economic, geographic, and political profiles, and therefore their challenges are different, and so their needs and capacities. So let me just briefly touch upon what are the existing and emerging challenges in terms of city sustainability as well as resilient development against climate change and environmental adversities. Irrespective of geography and socioeconomic profiles and socio-political profiles that I mentioned of the different cities, there are some common challenges and there are some location-specific challenges. Of course, we know that all contexts are different, cities are different, are situating in a different context. So that is why their challenges would be different. But regardless of their context, there are some common challenges, which mostly I will focus today from the perspective of mainly global southern cities or the cities from developing countries. One of the most common challenges is not to undertake people-centered approach of sustainable urban development and resilience building, which is, and these lesson actually came from our 30 years long experience of ICLEI working with urban development and urban development institutions in different countries. Cities and urban areas are not only a place of economic agglomeration, but it's a melting pot of different cultures, values, and diverse interests. It is still a very much common practice in many of the countries to disregard the most vulnerable and marginalized communities, their needs and their cultural values in decision-making process, which push them further marginalization and vulnerabilities. The second important challenge that I want to mention, that is the silo vision of development, both on thematic and geographic terms. Very often, the different agencies of the municipalities are working in silos without necessarily integrating other sectors in urban planning or climate adaptation planning or resilient development planning. Such working modality is counterproductive to the holistic approach of sustainability, which is necessary, of course, and creates kind of development disasters, all maladaptation in cities and within the broader regions. Also, interventions in cities without their surrounding regions are mostly futile because cities are effectively depending on their hinterlands, regions for their resource flows such as food, water, and human resources. And finally, my third point and the last point for challenges, there are multiplier negative impacts that has been created of working in such challenges that I have already mentioned against the backdrop of rising impacts of climate change. Adaptation and resilient programs often do not produce the expected outcomes because of these such working modalities, such as they often do not produce risk reduction outcomes or resilient building outcomes. Rather, what the current approaches are doing, redistributed the risk to the different areas, to the different population groups who are often politically disempowered. So that is one of the major negative outcomes that we have seen because of the current working modalities and current challenges which are not necessarily addressed. So the challenges are multifaceted, and mostly it is the poor and vulnerable communities in the urban areas bear the brand. So whilst we are talking about the enhancing capacities of cities, it should be increasing cities' abilities to increase the capacities of poor and vulnerable communities to fight against climate change impacts. Formal local government institutions need to develop their trusted relationship with the communities through multidimensional efforts, tools, projects, and initiatives. We from ICLEI, supporting local government as the entry points of local level resilience building through various efforts such as Green's Climate Cities program based on climate neutrality framework, which encourages cities to undertake sequential activities such as analyze, act, and accelerate. Secondly, we have transformative action program to increase climate actions and financial investment. We encourage them to undertake bankable projects. Thirdly, we promote campaigns and initiatives such as Making Cities Resilience Campaign 2030. And also we offer a reporting system for the cities. One offer, namely CDP ICLEI Unified Reporting System, where cities can report their progress towards resilience. So these are some of the efforts that we are currently undertaking to meet some of the challenges that I have mentioned. And I will be very much happy to report further on that if anybody interested. I am stopping here. Thank you very much. And back to you, Ronald.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huck. Very interesting perspectives there. I think I captured your thoughts in maybe three ways. You called on the need to look at how we integrate DRR and CCA, particularly at the local level. You looked at the challenge of siloism, particularly the siloed approach of the development actors, which are driving a counterproductive pathway towards the results that we're seeking to achieve. And then you talked about the multiple impacts, programs that do not produce the required outcomes based on the current working modalities, which are presenting in themselves multifaceted challenges. Quite interesting, and I'm really looking forward to the interactions from our participants around some of these very important points. Our third panelist, Ms. Nayoka Martinez-Backstrom. She is the Senior Program Manager and Thematic Coordinator on Urban Development with the Swedish International Development Agency. Ms. Backstrom will speak on scaling up bilateral cooperation on urban resilience and the role of partnerships, an issue which is critical from resilience building perspective. And of course, you heard from ASG Okai on the importance of partners in the process. So yes. Without further ado, I invite you, Nayoka, to take the floor for your 5 minutes.
Yes, it's such an honor to be here to represent my agency, SIDA, which is Sweden's government agency responsible for international development cooperation. We work for sustainable development, and we help create conditions for people living in poverty and oppression to improve their lives. SIDA has bilateral cooperation agreements with 35 countries, and we have regional cooperation and thematic strategies as well. Sweden is signatory to the main global development frameworks. So it means that as SIDA, we align our activities according to these commitments. About half of SIDA's budget is categorized as humanitarian assistance, and about 46% of our total budget is channeled through the multilateral system. So when we talk about partnerships, we have huge UN agencies like UNDP, UN-DRR, UNEP, UN Habitat as among our major partners. Now, urban resilience is an important issue that SIDA is addressing through a number of entry points, thus ensuring that we integrate this with, for example, sustainable environment, natural resource management, and biodiversity, climate adaptation, and to some extent mitigation. We also work very much with addressing the vulnerabilities of communities, those living in informal settlements and in conflict and post-conflict contexts. Sustainable housing and basic infrastructure with a focus on access by poor and informal settlements in cities requires an urban resilience lens. Even the work around economic opportunities, innovation for development, for example. These are relevant entry points. Improving livability, promoting urban safety are essential. Sustainable agriculture, production of food systems. So you can name so many ways by which we work with urban resilience issue. And it integrates within many of our efforts addressing the humanitarian development and peace nexus. We also try to find the balance between normative and operational efforts, and this is very important as a bilateral cooperation approach. We have to remind ourselves, however, that as SIDA and other bilaterals, we are not an implementing agency, but we are a funding and dialogue partner. So we support the efforts of partners who formulate the policies and strategies and who actually implement the actual development activities. It is important that development cooperation in this respect reaches the local level. This is to ensure that local communities and organizations are part of the resilience building efforts. We recognize that building the resilience of partners themselves is necessary because of the difficulty of their operating context. The role of development cooperation is also to help unlock other sources of financing, including from the private sector. Development cooperation, or what we know as aid, represents only about 20-25% of all external financial flows for development activities. So it doesn't count local resources that are both actual and potential. So much of our efforts should also focus on unlocking these resources. As Sweden, we are a big supporter to the global climate funds, but funds have difficulty to reach local governments and local organizations due to lack of competence and bankability. So more has to be done in this regard. Some of the emerging priorities as well from SIDA's point of view are the application of our guarantee instruments and development of new financing models, tapping private actors such as insurance companies for climate risk mitigation of infrastructure programs in cities. We also support project preparatory facilities through development banks, for example, and we have convened a platform for Swedish and global business leaders, including a platform for pension funds so that they align to development funding principles. And the climate crisis and urban resilience is central to many of these efforts. So I will end with some reflections from a development cooperation point of view. Urban resilience policies and strategies need to be institutionalized and owned by the counterpart government, city, and civil society. So our partnership approach has to be focused on that level of ownership. It is important to work within the national context for urban planning, legislation, financing, and governance. And our colleague from India has expressed this clearly. Urban resilience should be integrated into relevant government policies and priorities and not be treated like standalone isolated projects or programs. We need institutions in place dealing with issue, and we need to work on the capacity of these institutions, that they should have governance, planning, and implementation capacities. And we also need to work with networks of cities and CSOs because this enables peer learning, which is a powerful incentive and a way for scaling up efforts and reaching the global level. We need to focus on generating data and evidence because the policy recommendations we make have to be based on reliable data. And finally, and I loved it when this was mentioned by our earlier speakers, we need to pay special attention to the needs of secondary and intermediary cities, which comprises about 30% of the total number of cities.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nayoka. That was extremely interesting. I took too many notes, quite a bit there at the end, including your key takeaways. But certainly the issue around how SIDA brings attention to dealing with the underlying drivers came out in your remarks, and I think this is very important to note, because if we're not tackling these drivers, then we're not going to be able to build resilience. And I think that's certainly one of the takeaways that SIDA has put a lens there, including identifying some of these key entry points for driving this urban resilience agenda, and the need to balance the normative and the operational, both being very important in advancing this agenda. And what I particularly found interesting was the work in trying to promote putting people at the center of the process, not only as beneficiaries, but as partners in that development process, which is certainly something for us to look at going forward. Capacity issues, but more importantly, unlocking new financing through better engagement with the private sector. And you give us a raft of approaches there. Thank you very much. Quite interesting.
Thanks.
And we look forward to your inputs in the discussions. I now want to invite our fourth panelist, Professor Bharat Daye. Now, Professor Daye is from the School of Global Studies, Thammasat University, Thailand, an extraordinary professor from the School of Public Leadership as well in Stellenbosch University in South Africa. It is important to note that he contributed to the World Cities Report of 2020 and brings practical reflections about addressing urban resilience and sustainability in the context of convergence of risk and development in cities. Professor Barrett, you have the floor for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ronald. Honorable Ms. Asako Okai-sama, Director and Assistant Secretary General, Crisis Bureau, UNDP. Mr. Ronald Jackson, Head of UNDP DRR and Recovery for Building Resilience Team. Fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, warm greetings to all of you. First of all, I would like to congratulate UNDP Crisis Bureau for leading the timely preparation of Urban Risk Management and Resilience Strategy paper through a global consultative process. The synthesis from the analytical review conducted for the strategy paper, which UNDP shared with us, covers a vast ground and highlights the various important unmet demands and emerging priorities in urban risk management and resilience. Secondly, I would like to thank UNDP for the kind invitation to this panel to share thoughts on addressing urban resilience and sustainability in the context of convergence of risks and development in cities. On this theme, I would like to emphasize 3 points. First, urban resilience and sustainability are interconnected. One is incomplete without the other. One cannot move forward without the other. This becomes evident in the case of low-income settlements in cities, for instance. It is where the vulnerability to multiple risks and lack of sustainable urban development converge, thus resulting in intra-urban inequality and posing multiple challenges such as social inclusion and poverty. Second, in real world, and I emphasize in real world, urban development precedes urban planning, giving rise to vulnerable cities. A good example of this phenomenon is the rapid peri-urban development taking place in cities around the world. This happens despite urban planning. This happens beyond the planning boundaries, locking in patterns of urban vulnerability and negatively impacting regional environment and life-supporting ecosystems. Third, addressing urban resilience and sustainability urgently requires proactive urban governance and policy making for cities. This was considered to be very difficult before. However, the experience of COVID-19 pandemic has shown that national, subnational, and city governments can be proactive in formulating and implementing policies and plans geared towards addressing the fast-changing realities with cutting-edge foresight. As a way forward, I would like to submit 3 points for your consideration. First, it is important to utilize the systems thinking approach towards building urban resilience and sustainability as in the profession of urban planning highlighted earlier. Systems thinking is holistic and wide-ranging. It is difficult, but the problem we are dealing with are even so. Difficult problems need difficult solutions. It is important to break departmental silos and apply problem-solving approaches. This contains the promise of improving urban planning and governance in the long run. The second point for your consideration is it is important to bring in innovations for the delivery of public goods such as resilience and sustainability. It requires a different way of fostering innovations. This may be done by co-designing and co-implementing short-term and medium-term urban projects that inform long-term urban planning and governance. Finally, for all this to work, there is an urgent need of well-managed urban knowledge systems, not simply urban information systems that have been highlighted before or have been pushed before. Urban knowledge systems need to focus on geographical and chronological knowledge and experience that is focused on risk-informed development and resilience. In this case, we may need to build, we may have to backcast or futurecast based on local knowledge and experience. Reflecting on all this, and in sum, it is critical that building urban resilience goes hand in hand with achieving sustainable urbanization. UNDP has a unique advantage to take lead in this work by building multi-stakeholder partnerships with different type of agencies, with various international agencies, national governments, local authorities, private sector, civil society organizations, and other partners. With that, I thank you for your kind attention, and it'll be great to have some discussion afterwards. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Professor Barrett. Quite interesting. You walked us through the causes of urban inequalities. You pointed to a very important point that urban development is preceding urban planning, and really caused us to think through how do we shift back to the putting the sort of horse before the cart, and if I may say. You talked about the importance of proper governance and policy making and outlined 3 very clear areas forward for us. The systems thinking approach, which it's good that we're seeing a convergence between the thinking you shared and that from Kamal. Innovation for delivering the public good of urban resilience, and an area, public goods, often underfunded, under-resourced at national government level and local government level. And of course, you pointed to the importance of having a well-managed urban knowledge system built on risk-informed development, including tools like backcasting and futurecasting. Quite interesting. And you close with providing a very clear pathway, or value added, I should say, of UNDP in this particular process. Our next panelist joins us from Japan, Dr. Kozo Nagami, who has worked in challenging development context. Dr. Nagami is a group director on disaster management for JICA, and that's the Japan International Cooperation Agency, and he will be speaking to us on addressing disaster and climate risk in cities, strengthening human security and fostering resilience. Dr. Nagami, thank you for joining us, and I yield the floor for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ronald and Okai-san, to give me this opportunity to explain our thoughts regarding the human security and urban development. Natural hazards can cause the most serious and persistent damages to the vulnerable in our society. Hazards, physical shocks, initially cause damages to the society unequally heavily on the most susceptible part and induces social and economic losses. The cascading effects of those damages and losses expand and extend as time goes by. But vulnerable households without proper capacity and access to resources cannot swiftly recover from those cascading damages and losses. Thus, it is significantly important to consider how we can protect the vulnerable from hazards so as to achieve the human security. Disaster risks are composed of 2 aspects. Next slide, please. Sorry. Disaster risks are composed of 2 aspects: intrinsic vulnerability and extrinsic hazard and exposure. It is necessary to tackle with both of these 2 disaster risk factors in pre-disaster manner. As for the intrinsic vulnerability, we should minimize the vulnerable population through multi-sectoral leave no one behind approach. We should disaggregate the vulnerable and support them to enhance their capacity with equality, not equity principle. We must incorporate all the sectors, including health, education, social welfare, and infrastructure, without being stuck in silos. On the other hand, we should address the extrinsic risk factors, hazard exposure, at the same time. This part is what really demands the DRR actions. Vulnerable people tend to reside in disaster risk areas such as floodplain that were used to be left undeveloped due to the historical records or oral traditions on disasters. Recent urbanization that is not enough aware of disaster risk has converted such areas into residential areas. In addition, once a disaster is triggered by hazards, following cascading economic and social damages and losses will be imposed heavily on the vulnerable due to their low capacity to withstand and recover. This means that we have to secure the structural measures to fundamentally control the hazard and the exposure at the most upstream in the multi-stage cascading effects. Such systematic DRR investment, prioritizing the upstream control, is imperative to secure the sustainable urban development. Next slide, please. Of course, it is important to anticipate hazards going beyond the structural measures, even taking into account the recent climate change. To deal with such intensive risk, not only additional structural measures such as multi-layered structure and resilient critical infrastructure, but also non-structural measures such as early warning system and social capital enhancement enabling self and mutual help are important as well. However, in many developing countries, even the minimum structural measures are not sufficient at all to properly mitigate the primary damage. If the government would just give up building up the fundamental structural measures as the public responsibility, but concentrate investing in non-structural measures, the vulnerable would be kept in the downward spiral with disasters. Next slide, please. Based on the lesson learned from past disasters in Japan, such as 2011 Great East Japan earthquake, JICA DRR group is focusing on the following three pillars. Number one, realizing pre-disaster investment for the capital concentration centers, especially in megacities. Number two, establishment of DRR institutions for understanding disaster risk and strengthening disaster risk governance. Number three, securing Build Back Better recovery in the disaster-affected areas. These three pillars are expected to contribute to the achievement of global targets of Sendai Framework, as well as SDGs, goal number 1, number 9, number 11, and 13. Thank you so much. Back to you, Ronald.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nagami. Very pertinent perspective, emphasizing the need to connect both ends of the spectrum, reducing susceptibility of critical infrastructure to disaster risk and climate impacts. But more importantly, I think the call around building the social capital, building the resilience of communities by reducing socioeconomic vulnerabilities. And you outlined very, very clearly the fact that if the enabling environment for the softer side of the infrastructure isn't achieved, then no matter what we invest in the hard side in terms of the physical infrastructure, we're going to be seeing people still trapped in this downward spiral brought on by the failure points. You've raised the issue around the need for pre-disaster investment and for strengthening their institutions, particularly this issue around risk governance. And we've been talking about systemic risk, the need to look at strengthening these institutions to deliver on better systemic risk governance. And then this old idea of building back better, some say building forward better, remains a very good opportunity, a good window for addressing some of these resilience issues which we are harking after. Our sixth panelist, Ms. Shrutinarayan, is the regional director, South and West Asia for C40 Network. She will be sharing her thoughts on effective stakeholder engagement for inclusive urban development, particularly addressing gender and leaving no one behind concerns. Thank you, Shruti, for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you in the next 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ronald, and thank you to all the panelists for setting such a strong context. So I think it's already established that cities are sort of hotbeds and very critical, sort of areas that we have to focus on. And we know that we are urbanizing, and it's going to be, even at a faster rate. We're already at 55%, and the projection is of almost 68% by 2050, and that's significant. And it's also been established that the rate, it's not only the rate at which we are urbanizing, but it's also the quality at which we are urbanizing, which is really leading us to look and understand at what is happening at the city level. C40 is actually an organization that's focused on working with cities. We have the network of 97 cities that we work with at the political leadership level. So we look at commitments at the political leadership level, and that's very important because political leaders are actually, really looking at how they can manage and address stakeholders, because they have come, from an election process, and they have to address these mandates that, they won on. And so we work with them on looking at what could be structures that are set within the city framework for climate. The second point that I want to make is that resilience and development is related to climate action. And I think it's one and the same thing. And I think some of the panelists have actually brought that point forward. But at C40, we look at urban development from a lens of climate action. And please note, I'm saying climate action and not planning, because now we're at the stage of climate action. And one of the requirements of C40 membership is for all cities that become C40 members is to take an integrated climate action process that is inclusive, and that focuses on how we can bring through different stakeholders, very focused on gender and vulnerable communities, knowing that they are probably going to be impacted the most from climate. So it's very critical, in the climate action process that we follow, that it's an inclusive process. And why is it important is because, you cannot have an action on the ground that is not owned by people. And we believe that all communities and everybody on the table has a stake in this. And if we do not bring them on the table to participate in this process, we're not going to get any action on the ground that is going to be implemented, and it's just going to kind of stay on discussions. And I can bring forth some examples, like in Barcelona, we worked with the city, and they've just finished a climate action plan that actually, it's called a co-produced climate action plan, because they work together with various sort of societal organizations, that looked at gender and other stakeholder groups to be brought together to actually look at how one can develop a climate action plan that can be owned by all of these groups. And it's also important when you're doing this, that you're not just looking at mitigation and adaptation that are important aspects of climate action and resilience, but you're also looking at access. So one of the important parts when you're looking at, inclusive climate action planning is to see how some of these, marginalized groups, what is the quality of infrastructure they already have. So instead of just looking at mitigation and adaptation, I think one of the important things, and I think this is what Barcelona also did, is to look at what is the available and access to energy and water and infrastructure and the quality. Because a lot of these groups suffer from that in the cities. And then they don't want to participate in discussions on climate action if they don't even have the basic needs in place. So I think when you're building action and resilience and looking at inclusive development, it's very critical for us to ensure that there is basic quality of infrastructure provided that leads to the discussion on action planning. And that is then further developed into an implementation plan that's owned by everyone. And just on my last comment, it's also important on the financial implications because cities end up spending a significant amount in responding to climate, action and issues that come up. And if they're diverting this to climate action from a get-go, they actually see that they're saving money. And Barcelona, for example, allocated almost 1.2 million euros that they actually asked different stakeholder groups to submit actions and projects for climate action. So that really reflects on how one can look at an inclusive aspect of developing climate action and resilience. So thank you so much for that, for this discussion, Ronald. I'll give it back to you to invite the next panelists.
Oh, fantastic, Shruti. The points you raised really resonated with me, particularly this idea around the work you're doing in touching on some of the political imperatives itself. Often a sensitive space, but certainly the importance of building resilience does require a look at the politics of resilience building, and engaging those particular actors are important. You talked about the ample coverage of resilience as an integrated, inclusive, stakeholder-focused theme, which I found quite interesting and something we can pick up on later. And of course, moving beyond the discussion to results delivered on the ground. A red thread there between the points raised by our speaker from CEDA, where we talked about achieving measurable impact on the ground, and that came out in your presentation. And of course, the availability and accessibility of city dwellers to basic infrastructure services as a critical starting point for planning. So people's rights to access, we hear coming out there. And then this issue around converting the enormous spending we make on post-crisis situation as investments in building resilience, which saves in the end. Colleagues, thank you. Our seventh panelists, we could not have engaged in a discussion on urban resilience without the perspectives from our private sector colleagues. And so we have with us Ms. Veronica Gabriel to share insights from the consortium of private sector entities in the Philippines. She's the executive director of the Philippines Disaster Resilience Foundation. And I'm quite delighted to hand the floor to Veronica, who will provide us with her thoughts on leveraging private sector as a key partner for urban resilience. The floor is yours, Veronica. Very interested to hear your points.
Thank you, Ronald. A warm greeting to everybody, and I'm honored to be invited to this forum to talk about leveraging private sector as a key partner for urban resilience. To frame my discussion this evening, let me give you a brief hazard profile of our country. Next slide. On a yearly basis, 20 tropical cyclones enter our area of responsibility, 90 of which will make landfall and will cause devastating landslides, flooding, and storm surge in the affected areas. And in the past 10 years, our typhoon has become stronger and more devastating. In 2013, next slide, the super typhoon Haiyan, everybody knows that, the strongest storm ever reported at landfall, caused over 6,000 reported fatalities and damaged 1.1 million homes in 9 regions. We are also inundated by these seismic activities, and right now we have 4 volcanic active volcanoes in our country. Next slide. And next slide, please. This affects everything, or all of these hazards affect all sectors of our society. And in our country, 90% of our workforce are part of the private sector, so that the dialogue on urban resilience should also be through a whole of society approach. Next slide. As DRR focused organization, we looked into 3 aspects: disaster risk assessment, the hazard profile of our country and its potential impact to communities, and businesses became the backbone of our organizational structures and programs. Thus, we made a significant shift in our organizational focus to building disaster resilience of the communities and businesses, in addition to our response and recovery mandate. The second aspect we looked into is this stakeholder assessment. And you are looking at the cluster system that we have right now, where we organize our member companies according to their core competencies and build an ecosystem toward disaster resilience, which no single organization can build on its own. You have to be part of a network of people, organizations, and government agencies working toward disaster resilience. The third aspect we looked into the DRR policies, next slide, and laws of the government, as well as the UN humanitarian system and other local actors operating in our country. We deemed it essential to be interoperable with both systems, so coordination and ways of working together is more efficient. Next slide. At the local level, we bring to the community innovative approaches in community-based DRRM intervention. This is an example of a 3D mapping at the barangay level, the smallest political unit in our country. And this allows us to involve all stakeholders and participate in DRR planning for their community. And all this planning, we get to test, we get to put into drills and exercises. At the national level, next slide, PDRF serves as the enabler that links both private sector, especially at this, for this example, we have the energy, power, water industries, with the government in order to come up with harmonized sectoral resilience initiatives. Next slide. In this slide, you will see the different public-private partnerships that we have embarked on together with the government to make sure that we undergo joint planning activities and all of our contingency plans are harmonized, both in the private sector and in the government, with the government agencies. Next slide. One of our PDR organization's flagship program is business continuity, designed for our member companies and their supply chain and distribution networks, as well as SMEs, which make up more than 90% of our country, our economy. In partnership with the Office of Civil Defense, we provided technical assistance in establishing public service continuity program for national government agencies. This joint effort led to the development of a standard public service continuity plan for all government agencies. This is to ensure continuity of essential functions of the government. Innovations in ICT have proven to be highly effective tools in disaster management. And these range of technologies fuel our Emergency Operations Center in Clark. Next slide. PDRF operates an Emergency Operations Center, which, as they say, is the first in the region to be led by the private sector. And in this Operations Center, we developed a platform called Handa, which is our platform to make sure that we provide them with to report and the dashboard, which will aid managers in critical and life-saving decision-making. PDRF works in a premise that a strong public-private partnership drive disaster risk reduction and resilience both at the national and local level. This collaborative form of engagement allows us to participate in policy formulation, establishing standards, and sharing private sector expertise. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Veronica. Very interesting. So, you pointed to the fact that 90% of the workforce is in the private sector. And I think that's certainly a good incentive for private sector engagement in this process, given the number of people who are engaged. And of course, the fact that the private sector holds a large part of risk in any country. You talked about these ecosystems of the private sector and how that can be leveraged to ensure that urban resilience can be delivered both at national level, but also within the local governance regime, and pointed to these PPPs. But what I liked about that was this idea around harmonizing these private sector programs with sort of government's approach and policy and coordinating, fostering this new way of working that we've heard come out from some of the speakers before. And then this investment in government continuity planning. So if government are the enablers, then certainly for them to have cities up and running, they themselves have to be able to be up and running quite quickly, but more importantly, help to prevent these calamities as we've seen, and then leveraging private sector innovation as a driver for urban resilience. All very interesting takeaways. Participants, delegates, thank you for very informative and thought-provoking contribution to our discussion this afternoon. I'm confident that these will help us refine the thinking and inform the strategic direction and programmatic offer for UNDP's urban resilience. Without much ado, we want to now open the floor for discussions and for taking some of the questions from our panelists. I see that our chat has been enlivened with questions. And feel free, dear panelists, to pose some key questions to your colleagues as well. And one of the key questions we have coming in, I think, is directed at our speaker Kamal Kishore, who talked about this issue of urban blind legislation and urban sensitive legislation. Talk to us a little bit more about that, Kamal. How do we move from just simply talking about it to actually delivering on these types of legislation that are not urban blind?
Thank you very much, Ron. That's a very good question, and I will say that there are three elements to addressing that. The first thing, when we talk about a legislation, a disaster risk management legislation that works in the urban context, the first thing we have to talk about and we need to recognize is that the notion of local level or the notion of community is somewhat different in the urban context than in the rural context, especially in rapidly urbanizing situation. Some communities may not have the kind of social capital they may have had in their rural hinterland. So how does legislation help build a sense of community, foster that, enhance the capacity at that level? So that's one thing. The second thing is that, which is simply administrative. From an administrative perspective, if you have three levels of disaster risk management structures in a country, where you have a nation, you have state, and then you have district. And if there's a district, if multiple districts form an urban agglomeration, that needs to be formalized as an urban disaster risk management structure. You can't ignore that there are 4 districts, contiguous districts, which have urbanized over the last 10 years or 20 years, and they have their unique requirements, they have their unique challenges. And the third point with regards to urban is that the expectations that urban citizens have, the kind of capacities, resources, initiative, and imagination that urban citizens have is different from people in the rural areas. How do we take that into account? There's a lot of self-organization that happens in times of disasters, but also before disasters to meet common challenges. So right now, it appears to me that a lot of the legislation that came into existence 15, 20 years ago hasn't exercised its urban imagination. But at the same time, I would underline this, that I don't necessarily have all the answers to this, but it has become really evident in the last few years of practice. And this is something that UNDP could perhaps focus on. How do we make sure that, inevitably after the pandemic, there will be demands for, looking at legislation in a fresh perspective with incorporating the lessons. That would also be an opportunity to apply an urban lens to taking another look at disaster legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamal, and thanks, Maria Hassan, for that question. We have a question here. We've heard so much about resilience. Resilience involves addressing various dimensions and requirements simultaneously. given the challenges articulated by many of our panelists today, it might be good for us to dive a little bit into this. And so I'm going to pose to Professor Barrett a question. How best can we help cities diagnose and understand resilience in their particular city context, and then map out a pathway to address them holistically?
Yes, thank you. There are many tools, but what we find common in all the tools and approaches is that, first of all, we need to have a city ready to go for urban resilience approaches. So the first step really is that the city has the ownership. City is ready to take action. That means political ownership. That means the ownership from the entire administrative system, and also their willingness to partner with different stakeholders. That's the step one. The second is that there has to be conducted the vulnerability and adaptation assessment, which means that we need to understand what are the challenges, what are the threats, what are the risks, not only now, what has been in the past, sort of backcasting, what is going to come in the future based on climate change projections. And then we understand what are the hotspots, what are the pain points, and who is affected, how much, in which kind of part of the city. So in a way, we have a map of a city which is informed not only by the government, but various stakeholders that are around this panel, as well as local communities living in low-income settlements and other settlements which may be most adversely affected. The third thing is we need to understand what are their priorities, and then we need to convert those priorities into objectives for the policy making and planning process. So if one area is going to be completely inundated, for example, due to higher level of flooding, then we need to think of moving that community elsewhere on a higher ground. Or if one community may not be affected that much, we may have to look for reinforcement of the housing stock and similar approaches. There may be other approaches related to changing professions or development of skills. And the fourth part is to start implementing these plans with funding from different agencies, for which we need to have multi-stakeholder partnerships, financing, strengthening municipal finance, and getting more finance from other development partners, local, national, and international. And then lastly, to see whether we are actually implementing what we decided to. So that sort of gives a feedback loop into the initial thinking on what we need to be doing. So that way, if we follow these several steps, we would have a holistic understanding of what is required at a city level and how we can achieve that, and with the partnership of whom and with what kind of resources. So this is a broad answer to your question, Ronald. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Barrett. Now, ASG Okai referred to a key challenge in her opening remarks regarding the disconnect between national policies and city level application. I think it came up quite pointedly in one of the presentations around the need for, well, probably from the lens of Kamal, particularly on legislation. So in reference to this point, the disconnect, it is a gap that came up in our analysis. How best then can this be addressed effectively? I would appreciate perhaps Dr. Hook, maybe you could share some thoughts from your own experience working on urban resilience issues. How do we resolve this particular gap, since it has come up so often, both in the presentation and in the deep analysis we undertook?
Thank you, Ronald, for the questions. Yes, ICLEI has been working quite along in different scales of governance to minimize the distance between different levels of governance. And what now we are promoting exactly, that is we call multi-level governance, meaning that there must be some kind of synchronization in terms of policies, in terms of actions, be it in a different scales among different levels of governance. So that is why what our objective is to bring everybody on the same understanding regarding what is necessary, what is the demand, and what kinds of action we need to undertake. So that is why, although our areas of operation is mostly the local government, we keep national government or state government in a very close loop, and as much as possible put them into the direct dialogue process with the city level governance, city mayors, city councillors, or even rural or regional level governance. So it meaning that whatever kind of policies that we are proposing, or whatever kinds of actions that the cities or the regional or provincial level government are suggesting, that has been effectively communicated to the national government, meaning that both of them are on the same understanding. Okay, that has been going there, and that is the demand there, and we need to formulate our policies accordingly. So our understanding from our long experience is, without having these different governance system coming together, we really cannot achieve a kind of sustained and synchronized approach of local government. And that is what we are proposing. And that is very much encouraging that I can share with you that in our all projects that we have been implementing, we have a component that we call national dialogue. It meaning that we intentionally bring national and local government together to establish a dialogue process, to understand each other, to know each other, and how to better perform each other and to share each other in terms of knowledge and skills and other gaps. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've seen the impact COVID has had on our communities, our urban centers, all across the globe. We recognize that reducing risk requires a particular focus on addressing socio-economic vulnerabilities. As ASG Okai also referenced in her speech, she called them structural issues like inequality, marginalization, exclusion, poverty. I like to think of them as underlying drivers. Is our current way of working allowing us to really get at the heart of those particular issues which have given rise not just to the impact of COVID, but on many of the resilience issues we're tackling? I think Nayoka also spoke to this a little bit in terms of CEDA's focus on tackling some of these underlying drivers. How do we move from symptom to some of the core issues outlined as gaps in ASG's Okai's opening remarks? I'm going to pose this one to perhaps Shruti.
So, I think like we discussed, right, I think it's important to have an integrated process. And I strongly believe that it's time that we look at climate action as a lens to look at this. And we clearly know that things are not working, right? I mean, COVID was just an example of what really made us wake up and have this discussion. But and C40 actually created a mayoral task force that looked at how can we recover from COVID-19, with the intent that the recovery is not just from COVID, right? It is from actually looking and setting structures, like you described, Ronald, an inherent way of looking at things for a long term. And that's what resilience is, right? It's our ability to be able to withstand these as they come again and again in different forms, and be able to ride through these, economically, socially, not being disturbed or not being as disturbed. I mean, we currently don't even know what kind of economic impact COVID has on us in different cities all over the world. And which just reflects to the fact that we somewhere did not have systems in place to address issues like COVID or disasters like COVID, which is just an example. So I think inclusivity and looking at how, public health, societal inequalities, and, looking at how all the stakeholders are on the table participating in this discussion and the city governments are responding in a cohesive and comprehensive manner to develop structures that are able to respond to this going forward would be the way to look at this.
Thank you very much, Shruti. Quite interesting. My last question, and I hope I haven't missed any panelists. So I'm gonna see. I have two. I think I have two panelists left, and I probably will pose my last question to them both. We heard certainly from Shruti that we haven't quite captured the impact of COVID on our world. Certainly, we heard in the presentation a range of between 80 and 150 million new poor. There are likely social and economic consequences that will manifest further down the line. And we've heard that we have to redouble our efforts. We hear this message about moving away from silos, changing the way that we work. And we've heard this a lot. What is the barrier that is stopping us from moving to this type of approach that many of our panelists spoke about, that we needed to change? We need to move out of a siloed approach into an integrated approach in order to redouble our efforts and bring about these macro transformation or macro results. I said we had two, but we have Dr. Nagami, we have Nyoka and Veronica. So I'm gonna lay hands on Veronica as the private sector, and then I want to hear from Dr. Nagami, and then Nyoka, you'll close that question and answer for me.
Thank you, Ronald. COVID really is an unprecedented situation that we are in, that has put us in right now. And at this point, there really is no other recourse but to work together, to work for the private sector, to leverage its resources, its capabilities to help the government. And that is what we have exactly done at the onset of the COVID response in our country. So last year in March, when we did the strict lockdown in our country, and seeing that our vulnerable sector will be affected, immediately the private sector gathered and raised funds to provide sustenance for the vulnerable sector. And then we went on to providing PPEs to the healthcare workers, providing food and also ventilators and other medicines to the hospitals. And now we are working very much closely with our government in the vaccine rollout. So, in this kind of catastrophic event, you just need to set aside politics. You need to set aside all these nuances in our society and come together and work. And that is what we have done in PDRF.
So the private sector is a very key broker in moving us beyond the politics and moving us to a new way of working, and we're hoping we can learn from that example. Dr. Nagami, any thoughts on that question?
Yes, thank you. As we already experienced that the COVID, we faced a very complicated cascading risk, compound risks, triggered by not only COVID but multi-hazard, phenomena. And but we should not get panicked with those, consequences. And we have to clearly look at the fundamental part of those cascading risk system and mechanism. And for the first part, as I presented in my presentation, intrinsic part of the fundamental risk is, poverty and vulnerability. And, we have to talk with, those vulnerable people with disaggregating with detailed data analysis of the society, the structure and the brackets. And we have to enhance their capacity. That is the intrinsic vulnerability part. And the second part is extrinsic fundamental risk part. That is the natural disaster, a natural hazard kind of, vulnerability, exposure. And those kind of part, we have to deal solely with the DRR actions. For the developing countries, most of the cases, even the fundamental level of structural measures are not enough at all. And many Asian cities like Jakarta and Vietnam cities, almost every 2 years or 3 years, they are heavily damaged by flood due to the climate change as well. So for those fundamental part of the risk, we have to deal with intensively, working on the kind of structural part. Yeah, thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much. And Nayoka, what's your response to this issue around siloism and breaking that towards this integrated and macro results delivery?
Yeah, I think that one of the tragic effects of COVID is it has made us so individualized. It has forced people to look so inward and just to focus on what we consider to be basic needs. But it also has tested the soundness of our existing structures and systems. It also revealed how we have been prioritizing not just our investments or our attention, but also towards prioritizing towards different groups based on vulnerabilities and needs. So the whole COVID experience for me has revealed how important sound public governance is, actually, because we need the leadership, we need the public governance to ensure a very coherent, coordinated response to something that is really like far-reaching in its effect, and we still don't know what the effects may be. And we need a governance that would lead us to much more of this balance between the short-term and the longer-term prioritizations. So I see a really important role here that an organization like UNDP would play in achieving this sort of coherence in all these different efforts.
Interesting, and you've left us with a message there as well. UNDP's own role in shaping that means we also have to be fit for purpose in that regard. We are coming up on the end, and we certainly want to hear from each of you very quickly. What is your one takeaway? You've shared a lot with us. What's your one takeaway for UNDP and for listeners? And I'll start with Kamal.
Thanks, Ron. I think for me, it's very clear. Risk governance more broadly is UNDP's forte. And in the wake of the pandemic, it's inevitable that countries will be looking at whether their existing risk governance mechanisms have served them well. This is a great opportunity to bring in an urban lens into it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal. Dr. Hock.
Yes, thank you. And it was a very nice discussion. My message is very simple for urban resilience. Especially, we need to build resilience among the poor, marginalized, and vulnerable. We need to work. They are the bigger communities in urban areas, and we need to look for them. And unless otherwise their resilience is not established, resilience only for the few rich people will not serve anybody. It's a disservice to the urban areas.
Thank you very much. And then I will go to Nayoka.
Yeah, for me, it is that we are not discussing anything new here. We are talking about an old issue that is gaining urgency. So what have we learned from all these decades of efforts? Where are we now in trying to translate all these local efforts up to global frameworks? And how do we review the kind of results that we have achieved the last decade, given that we have global frameworks that we are trying to align to?
Brilliant. And Professor Barrett.
Thank you, Ronald. It has been a great discussion. I have worked with UNDP before, so my message is to the UNDP, leverage the UNDP strategic and programmatic approaches to mainstream building urban resilience in national policies and plans. And second, and integrate risk-informed development in urban planning. Through systems thinking, fostering innovation, and developing and managing urban knowledge systems in partnership with key actors at multiple levels.
Brilliant. And then I have Kozo, Dr. Nagami.
Yes, thank you. My last message is that disaster is multi-stage and multi-dimension, and it is very critical to control the most upstream part of the cascading disaster damages. And we have to wisely choose what to do to minimize the fundamental part of the cascading compound risks, even with the COVID and the climate change era. Yeah, thank you so much.
And last but certainly, no, not last. We have Shruti.
So I would say it's time for action is now. We have to look at the lens of climate change and climate action when we are addressing resilience and urban development. And we have to make it absolutely inclusive, that looks at including all stakeholders on the table when we are addressing this through the climate action lens.
And last but certainly not least, Veronica, your last word.
We have been working with UNDP for several years now, and I must say that I'd like to see UNDP continue its work in focusing on building the resilience of our micro and small medium enterprises, and also in harmonizing the framework from working from the community to the national government policies and advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So colleagues, I want to thank you again, especially our eminent panelists for joining us, and certainly thank my own ASG, Asako Okai, for really hosting and bringing opening remarks. We heard some key takeaways there in terms of the top line messages focused on governance, localization, the metrics, measuring and ensuring that urban resilience is indeed making an impact, leveraging UNDP's strategic reach, systems thinking, a focus on what we can manage, action, not talk, inclusivity, partnership, and harmonization, all critical words that we can take away from this discussion and to help to fine-tune and finalize our efforts on looking at urban resilience. Urban resilience inevitably requires adopting a holistic approach, looking at the need for coordinated and support to our national and city counterparts. We in UNDP are keen to foster a shared complementary approach by drawing upon our expertise across stakeholders to advance the objective of urban resilience. Thank you all for participating and for joining us on this journey. Special thanks to our eminent panelists for sharing their valuable perspectives and guiding our thinking. We look forward to your continued engagement. Thanks again.
Thank you, panelists. It has been a fantastic day. And then also the participants, I thank you all for joining us. Please stay tuned. We'll be fine-tuning our approach, and then we would roll out the offer in the urban resilience. Thank you all for joining the event.